I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Berière, who is Strategic Development Director from KPN. And Jos is going to be talking to us about how telcos can support 5G and the edge adoption for enterprise. Jos, welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you, Annie, for the nice introduction. And like said, the telco is one part of the ecosystem. That's how I'm going to approach it. So at this moment, I don't have all the answers, but I will provide the view from KPN on this and where we are from our perspective. And like you said, together as an ecosystem, I think we are able to find the different pieces of the puzzle to really make that market growth happening. And I should be able to share my screen because I have the presentation, so that is for tech support. In between, I can already say my background is in engineering, so I have a good understanding of the technology. But for the last 3 years, I work in business market. I have been responsible for the introduction of 5G, and throughout my whole career, I have working on both on the strategy level, but also on the implementation level. Meaning, I was always focused on, okay, where do we want to go, and can we already start with a good step in that direction? And that is important because a lot of the debate and discussions are about very high level talk, but what you learn on the short term sometimes give very good insight whether there's already value, whether you should already do things differently as an ecosystem. So also the customers, it's not only telco or ourselves. And if you are quite early in that stage, it's much more flexible. So the vested interests of all parties and also strategies are not too rigid at that moment. So I really like working in that area. I still cannot share my presentation because I did prepare obviously something. So that's for tech support. Now I'm the host. I have full control. So I'll put it on big screen. And for the last period, I have worked on the launch of 5G in business market. So that we launched our new portfolio of 5G in the business market in July, just before holiday season started. So the show in terms of, I really like the practice part, although it's always at the end, let's say, of the work, but there's some nice pictures of what I've done over the years. To really get the feedback loop completely, and then the handover to the regular departments is often done. And that part I always have to support on the operations, but also on the commercial part. So it's all in the title, Edge. When you talk about Edge, we talk today quite a lot also about 5G. And so that's why I think it's important to understand where KPN is with regard to 5G and what our strategy is. So we started quite early with customers and partners building up field labs. So we set up field labs to experiment to see where 5G brings value towards the market. We did that in existing ecosystems. So there were already different locations where the ecosystem was cooperating together, and we set up shop on those locations. So we added 5G, similar to what I think is reality. The 5G is a part of the puzzle rather than the other way around, that everyone with very nice ideas should come to the telco to see how 5G generates value. It's the other way around. There's already an ecosystem. There's a lot of digital innovation, and we added 5G to it. So I was also responsible for setting up 2 of those, and that's really nice to see how you set up the scope and the projects and the cooperation by adding 5G in already 2018, because we understood that 5G doesn't provide value by itself. Simply said, it's part of the digital chain. So what we did in July, what is really, let's say, we're very a little proud on, is that we introduced what we said value-added services. So they aim the whole business market, so small, medium enterprise, and large enterprise and corporate. So that means that we leverage our existing assets to provide more reliability for certain applications or for in certain areas. And we think with this approach, we can more flexible address upcoming needs of enterprises, and also for certain applications and user equipment, advanced user equipment in the Dutch market. And we wanted to stay as far away as possible to more hardware-based solutions, or where we had to really do a lot on the infrastructure part or have separate infrastructure. And we got also good feedback from both the market with this approach. We already knew that a little bit because we got that from our field labs, obviously, where we interacted quite closely with various customers and partners, but also from different telecom analysts. That this approach is much better scalable towards the future, and it's also much better, let's say, in relation towards our DNA. So we have a very nice asset and way of working, but it works quite good on nation scale, and it also works very good to address the whole business market, which needs more than consumer-based products, which are like best effort, very good. But business market will need for more than just consumer-based solutions. So, talking about the edge, I think, okay, these are for, I think, a lot of the people listening, open doors. So what is, from our perspective, edge about? Okay, simply by reducing the distance towards the cloud or the processing, you can improve, you can have new digital solutions which do need a low latency, which do need more resilience, because if the path is shorter, the path can feel less. That's more or less the idea. I think it's not new that you can say, okay, like the example of the 1 million, if you can move it closer towards the enterprise, I think the integration of new solutions to a single platform, it gets easier. You see that often also with a lot of legacy and install base. A lot is brownfield, obviously, that if you move closer towards an enterprise, they don't need to migrate as much towards cloud, which for security policy is a lot easier to adopt new digital solutions. So they can, let's say, have a more evolutionary approach when moving towards cloud, and already take advantage of new digital solutions. That's what we see a lot, that a lot of companies, especially in the more traditional industries, they just started with migration towards the cloud. So having something in between does make sense for their perspective to have already some more benefits with new digital solutions. And what we also see is that edge offloads, and it's like a mobile term, but we can offload a lot of the complexity of the user equipment. So you see very advanced cameras, for example, with AI on top of it. That makes the camera very expensive and also more complicated to innovate. By moving it towards the edge, you can save on the user equipment, deploying cheaper cameras, but you see it in various type of user equipment. Or the other way around, if you can already discard a lot of the data before moving it to a global cloud, you can offload a lot of the processing need in the global cloud, and also the scalability gets a little bit better if you do it early on in the digital chain. For that, obviously, you need to be able to discard a lot of the data, and that needs to be possible in your business process. And I see customers and the larger company customers who have more experience, let's say, in Edge, because there is already quite a bit around. They say, okay, it's all of the above. And this is like, I think a lot is already well known, and this is like really high level introduction. But saying we're moving a little bit towards reality. What I see at customers is when we talk in the Netherlands, we have the big clouds, public clouds are in the Netherlands, all present. The Netherlands is a country of 300 kilometers in all directions, more or less. So that's in light speed, 1 millisecond. And our network, 5G network, has a latency of 18 milliseconds. That's what we get right now out of it. Meaning that when you talk about new digital solutions, today we already have 90 milliseconds towards just a cloud today. So you should, I know in the other countries it's different, but it's important to look at that perspective. If we would say, okay, we're going to introduce Edge or push Edge at a certain customers or have a discussion to do AR, VR type of applications, it doesn't make too much sense, because you can do with 20 milliseconds, you can do already quite a bit proper AR, VR, with a much simpler implementation towards more the global cloud. Then also the reality, let's say, the integration effort, what we see is that a lot of the enterprise solutions, also an install base, are tightly integrated, sometimes proprietary, legacy protocols. The best example is the PLC, so programmable logic component, which is used a lot. And there the control and the information is on the same part. And then if it's so tightly integrated, moving anything towards Edge or more generic platform is virtually impossible. So there you see that although on high level it's really nice, but when you really start touching the different implementations or install base, you run in a lot of challenges where you see that the market is not there yet, let's say, or the different verticals. And you see the same, it's not just industry, you see it in health, we see it in roadside infrastructure. It's all these infrastructures are very tightly integrated, and from operator perspective, also the number of proprietary protocols and where different layers are tightly integrated, it's very high. It's let's say, for me, it's really hard to see, or let's say, this is like where operators were 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And that's also the advantage, but we should be realistic when talking with customers, that when we take steps, we should address this point and where to start. Because if you move in a too tightly integrated area, it's more like an R&D project than a really commercial project. So when you talk about in relationship to the more the global cloud or user equipment, Edge is still quite much smaller and fragmented. So to have a competitive solution, you need scale, or we need scale to be offer competitive propositions towards the market. So if we want to compete in that area, we need more scale to really have a proper discussion that we are more competitive compared to alternatives. So this is more realistic part. But what we say, okay, but how do you go about, or how do we go about, is that rather than starting at the capability perspective or looking at all the proprietary protocols or the install base, we take a more business-centric approach. We say, okay, when we talk with customers, we say, okay, for us, let's say for the ecosystem, Edge and the development or the opportunity of Edge at a certain customer or sector is really driven by the digital solutions it enables compared to the alternatives they have. And the alternative is doing still stuff manually, let's say leveraging existing assets longer. That can also be like the PLC. Run it for 2 years longer. That's also a way to go about. Then you don't have the advantages, but you also don't have the cost. and rather than a more supply driven approach, because a lot of the work and the changes also need to be done on the business processes, and also people need to be trained differently. So that's why we say, okay, we start at the customer side, and really where the customer can see the value of making changes and offer certain digital solution, how it fits in for him. And then we take the other steps. Let's say, okay, how are we going to make it happen, and what is really needed? And then you get questions, okay, where should be the edge, and where what is really needed? Is still global cloud a fine solution? Those are the answers which are much easier to answer when you have had a proper discussion on the customer side, or let's say where it does fit in the business process of the customer. So I've prepared like 3 different examples where we have discussion with customers and where we see it fit. They are part of, let's say, a bigger story where we see, okay, these examples resemble a much bigger market segment or opportunity which can grow, which take advantage of new technologies and new, let's say, which are much bigger than just this example. This is an example, and I wanted to talk you through so you understand, okay, how to have the discussion, how to define whether edge makes sense at the customer, how what is the when does it make sense at the customer or in the proposition, and what kind of requirements need to be met. So this is a quite nice example. It's not new. This is really already done quite a bit in let's say very large ports. So they track container numbers to register it in their systems, and also have a real-time insight in which trucks have passed the gate, and what kind of dangerous containers are on the terrain. But what is new is this is only done at very busy locations, and what we see as an opportunity that with the advent of 5G and edge, it can move towards much towards gates which have a much lower volume, much less passings, and also have much higher cost requirements. Where, let's say, at this installation at the high-end port costs like 500,000 euros, and that you can really move towards a price point of 200 euros a month. Those and that you have the functionality of the high-end port, but designed for a much lower volume of passings through the gate. And the value for a customer, because today it's done manually, of course, those passings of the gates, is that compared to a person writing it down or putting it into the system, this is real time, it's correct, and that does improve safety and productivity. And especially on the hazardous materials, it's important to always have a real-time insight in case of fires, etc. Exactly which materials are on site, and you can share it easily. So they do it today manually, of course, but okay, with the automated system, you have a much faster, more accurate response to that. So the value in that part is clear. The customer understands that. We see this kind of video analysis in other areas to just say for roads, dikes, real assets, and construction. They do a lot of analysis, but it's more often in preventive maintenance part. But how does edge make it more competitive towards the alternatives? Because there are, let's say, the manual I discussed. So there you need to make it the business case that you are more competitive to putting it into the system manually. So you have labor cost and mistakes and some upside in safety advantages. Today they say, okay, we can do with the laptop, it's not a laptop, but a separate processing unit locally. that's how they go about, but it complicates. The deployment gets complicated, more costly, because you need a more advanced engineer in deploying it, and also for the maintenance it's more complicated. So you can add those costs to it. And you know exactly what the cost they need also to, and from the party having this implementation partner which works with this, for them it's also scaling is a challenge, of course, if they every time have to deploy let's say a laptop locally. On the camera, they say to us it's too expensive and hard to develop. It's a very specific, all those cameras have very specific let's say ways to deploy applications on it to detect those numbers. So for them it's a no-go area, and running such an algorithm to identify the numbers on a global cloud is quite expensive still, I would say. And by doing it already on the edge, or that takes advantage that you can discard a lot of information, let's say all the picture data, quite early in the chain, rather than moving it all towards the cloud, which also complicates obviously the scaling of the solution. You only need to send out the number towards the cloud. And if you have a new opportunity saying, okay, you want to also check the hazardous stickers, which you see in the bottom, double check, you change the algorithm or add a second algorithm. So you can already, that's advantage of having edge, and that you can implement locally or let's say more regionally new algorithms also gives an advantage there for those guys compared to a more global cloud solution. So there we can see that edge can be more competitive compared to those alternatives. Or it all, let's say, with one use case, you don't have a business case. So for you need to stack a lot, but you see that this kind of video analysis, machine learning, a lot of new entrants are with good understanding of business processes, of imports, dikes, whatever they. Are coming up because the machine learning advent or advantages and cheap cameras and more affordable bandwidth, you see that it has inspired a lot of people to come up with solutions. Then some new servers. So that was more about cost and easier deployment. So we see although drones, it's complicated to fly, but they have a bright future in my mind, because this is an example of logistics, let's say, of drones. And the drones are obviously also used a lot of for inspection also, because it's quite more affordable to do compared to other solutions. But here, this is an example of what we do with medical goods. And with the drone, like blood, but there can be other cases, you circumvent obviously the traffic, but it's also causing less interference to road traffic, because right now it's done by just driving an ambulance with the blood or the other medical goods with the lights on through traffic, which causes interference, but also it's the reliability is lower to get it in time delivered. There you say, okay, there for the drone control and you need air traffic control if you go beyond line of sight, which is manually done. That you have to ask a clearance, like your plane. If there are only a few drones in the air, you can do it still based on planes approach, and then the one flying can behave like a plane and ask ATC for clearance to fly, and that's all done safely. But obviously this doesn't scale, and the alternative to move forward towards the global cloud, we believe that latency of 9 milliseconds is too high for these kind of cases, and the scalability is not good enough. So they're moving towards the edge, that you can have higher performance to have automated clearance of certain flight paths needs to be done when we start scaling these drones beyond the line of sight. On the one hand, it's more futuristic, but on the other hand, you see the advantages are quite clear, and there's a lot of development also in policies to make this happen. And what we see is the pilots are already starting off, so it can be sooner than maybe some of us expect, or what I expected in the past. We see that it moves quite forward, quite fast, and this is for logistics, for medical goods, which has also quite clear benefit for society, but also I think for inspection cases, for safety, you see it a lot in terms of people see the benefit of deploying drones in that area. And also be line of sight is quite faster compared to when you do it alternatively. Well, then more towards an example towards the more the brownfield cases. There, let's say when you have like a larger chemical plant or industry, you see there's a lot of data already coming from the assets, typically wired, but there are also some Wi-Fi, but a lot is wired. And when operational workers making an inspection round, they need a lot of data, or they are benefited by data about the status of these different assets. Often that's only available at the office, let's say in a LAN situation, and deploying Wi-Fi on these terrains is, well, very challenging. But the architectures are not designed to have an open connection to the internet, more or less, or to have it all based in the cloud. And I discussed that earlier. It's tightly integrated. It's really done in a specific way, in a closed network approach. And opening up is possible, and that's one of the alternatives, but it's really hard to maintain, and also from security perspective, it's deemed not. It sometimes introduces risks, unfortunately. So without having to go back and forth to the office or to ask from the supervisor additional information about the asset, whether it runs, whether it's providing the which temperature, these kind of figures. Having that information available at the fingertips of the worker provides obviously productivity benefit. It has been calculated that the productivity hours in one day of a field worker is around 50%, which can be much better. So, and these things help a lot with that. And what we also saw is that some assets are, when you deploy additional sensors, or when some wires break, it's complicated. Cellular or accessing the local LAN on a wireless way has a big advantages by doing it much faster. I've seen polluted ground, making it much longer to deploy or fix the wire on the location. So working around that while keeping the information still locally with the edge gives big benefits because it's quite closer to the way of working of today. Although these cases are challenging, but I've seen the alternatives, meaning today opening the enterprise networks by opening the ports and allowing additional MAC addresses and all kind of stuff. It's risky and sometimes complicated to maintain. And the other direct protocols creates quite divergence and different protocols, and really hard to really as a worker to make it simple. And Margaret to global cloud is like in these environments impossible, I would say. On the short term, it's a really long-term project. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for those three really interesting and really diverse use cases. I was just going to say we need to come to an end, and we have got one question as well for you.
Yeah, okay, I'm done. Okay, this is let's say you can take different approaches with the edge, but we take really a focus that we look at identifying the value at the customer, and that is local and sometimes also customer or vertical specific. You have to have a good or mutual understanding about the value of the edge. So the customer needs to understand, okay, what can edge bring for me? And the other way around, we have to understand, okay, where does it bring the value for the customer? Because that shapes and prioritizes a lot how we shape an edge proposition towards the market. And also
I think that mutual understanding is a really interesting point, because I've done a lot of work on digital transformation of all sorts, and quite often the diverse views of between the company trying to fulfill the need and what the customer thinks they want is like, you know, it's like huge. I'm going to ask a couple of questions now, if I may, from the audience. First of all, a question on the first question is about the video analysis use case, the first one that you showed, and it says you compare the edge advantages of having local compute, but should the real comparison be the edge versus the standard public cloud? So in this use case, our participant says, I cannot see any benefit of edge compute compared to global cloud. Should it be much cheaper to centralize and easier to manage for redundancy?
Well,
so I have to be a brief answer, I'm afraid, but
let's say what I've seen with let's say the idea that a global cloud is the cheapest implementation, I think that is not necessarily true. So the basic idea, if you don't need edge, don't use it, because it's an additional part of the chain, obviously. But when you it's all about, okay, how much of the data can be discarded in your business process. What we saw is that when you only need this case is about, it's a motion triggered camera. If it's only very limited and you can already quite early discard all the information and let's say of any data stream as soon as possible, you have a cost advantage compared to having it a global cloud implementation. And that's also what we see in other use cases, that you can get with edge a cost advantage. And that's something already done today by deploying the laptop locally, say. That's more or less the same, but the edge has moved towards the camera, more or less. But then you, rather than having the PC locally, you move it a bit more generic. That's more the comparison, I would say. So I would say, because you already see that the PC is done locally compared to doing the global cloud implementation, you already see that there is already a competitive advantage, that the global cloud may not always be the most cost-effective solution, but it really depends on the business process, I would say.
Okay, yes, thank you very much.